The decision you're about to make has already been made. Your brain just hasn't told you yet. That's not philosophy. That's a measured experimental result, and it changes something fundamental about what you think you are. Here's the experience everyone has. You deliberate, you weigh options, you decide, and then you act. The decision feels like yours. It feels like it happened in consciousness, through conscious reasoning, and then the body executed it. That sequence, deliberation, decision, action, feels so obviously right that questioning it seems absurd. The sequence is probably backwards. The feeling of being in charge, of being the author of your choices, is real as an experience. Nobody is disputing the experience. What's in question is whether that experience accurately describes the mechanism, and the data says it might not. Consciousness might be the announcement of a decision, not the making of it. The press release, not the meeting where it was decided. Let's look at the experiment that started this. Benjamin Libet, a neuroscientist at UC San Francisco, had a deceptively simple setup. Participants sat in front of a clock with a fast-moving dot and were asked to flex their wrist whenever they felt like it. Completely spontaneous. No prompt, no schedule, no signal telling them when. Just whenever the urge arose, move. He measured two things simultaneously. First, brain electrical activity through EEG, specifically looking for the readiness potential, a slow buildup of electrical charge that precedes voluntary movement. Second, the moment participants became consciously aware of intending to move, they'd note where the clock hand was when they first felt the urge. The readiness potential began about 550 milliseconds before the actual movement. That's expected. Brains take time to prepare actions. But conscious awareness of the intention to move came about 200 milliseconds before the movement, which means the readiness potential, the neural buildup toward the action, had already been running for 350 milliseconds before the person was aware of any intention to act. The brain was already committed to acting before the person knew they wanted to act. 350 milliseconds of neural preparation, already in progress, before consciousness showed up and experienced itself as the one deciding. This result was contested immediately and has been contested ever since. Maybe the readiness potential isn't actually a decision. Maybe it's just neural noise that happens to precede movement without causing it. Maybe Libet's method of having participants track clock positions introduced errors. These are real objections, and the debate is real. But then came 2008, and the lead time didn't stay at half a second. John Dylan Haynes, a neuroscientist in Berlin, ran a more sophisticated version using fMRI, which can track activity in specific brain regions, not just general electrical signals. Participants sat in a scanner and watched letters scrolling on a screen. Whenever they felt like it, they pressed a button with either their left or right hand, a binary choice purely spontaneous. They reported which letter was showing when they made the decision. Haynes could look at activity in prefrontal and parietal cortex, regions involved in planning and intention, and use that activity to predict which hand the participant would choose. The prediction was possible up to 10 seconds before the person reported deciding. 10 seconds, not 350 milliseconds. 10 seconds of neural information predicting a choice that the person hadn't consciously made yet. The brain's decision-relevant activity was running almost a full commercial break before any subjective experience of choosing. Now, to be precise, this doesn't mean the brain predicted the choice with 100% accuracy. The prediction was better than chance, not perfect. The neural signal was probabilistic, but the existence of a predictive signal that far upstream of conscious awareness is hard to explain if consciousness is actually the origin point of decisions. What it suggests is that the decision process is running largely, maybe mostly, below the level of awareness, and that conscious experience of deciding is downstream, the conclusion of a process, not the beginning of one. Libet himself took this seriously. But he also noticed something in his own data that offered a more nuanced picture. There's a window between the unconscious readiness potential starting and the actual movement executing. There's a gap, and participants could cancel movements during that gap. The urge would arise, the neural buildup would start, and then, sometimes, the participant would decide not to move. They could veto the action even after the unconscious process had already begun. Liebet proposed that this is where free will actually lives, not in initiating actions. The unconscious starts that before consciousness arrives, but in vetoing them, stopping the process that's already in motion, the ability to say no to what the unconscious has already started saying yes to. It's a much smaller role for conscious will than we imagine, not the author of decisions, the editor with the power to kill a story before it runs, but not the power to have written it from scratch. The veto is real, the gap is real, but the initiating, the first move that seems to have happened without you, and even the experience of understanding why you decided, the felt sense of knowing your own reasons, that's a separate problem. Michael Gazzaniga, one of the most important neuroscientists of the 20th century, spent decades studying split-brain patients, people whose corpus callosum, the main connection between the two brain hemispheres, had been surgically severed to treat severe epilepsy. When the hemispheres can't communicate, you can show information to one hemisphere without the other knowing. And that creates experiments that reveal something disturbing about normal brains. Gazzaniga and colleagues could flash a command, walk, visible only to the right hemisphere, which controls the left side of the body. The patient would stand up and start walking, but the left hemisphere, which handles speech and narrative, hadn't seen the command. When asked, "Why did you just stand up?" the left hemisphere needs to answer. It has no idea why the body moved. It never says, "I don't know." Not once. It produces an answer immediately, confidently, fluently. "I wanted to stretch my legs. I was going to get some water." Something plausible, something that fits, invented in real time and delivered as memory. Gazzaniga called this the interpreter, a system in the left hemisphere whose job is to generate explanations for behavior and experience, regardless of whether it has access to the actual cause. It doesn't wait for accurate information. It produces a story that fits and calls it understanding. The split brain setup makes this visible because the two hemispheres are isolated and we can see the gap between what happened and what the interpreter says happened. In normal brains, both hemispheres communicate constantly, and we can't run this comparison. But there's no reason to think the interpreter operates differently in normal brains. We just can't catch it as cleanly, which means the feeling of knowing why you did something, that clear, confident sense of your own motivations, is frequently a post hoc narrative. The interpreter found a story that fits the action and delivered it as introspection. The feeling of self-knowledge is real. The accuracy of that self-knowledge is not guaranteed. This connects to the broader picture of how much of the work happens below awareness. Estimates vary. 95 to 99% of neural processing is unconscious. Not repressed, not hidden, just below the threshold of awareness. Language comprehension is unconscious. You hear a sentence and understand it, but the work of parsing syntax, resolving ambiguity, extracting meaning was all done before the understanding appeared. Object recognition is unconscious. You see a chair, not a collection of edges and surfaces your visual system assembled. Emotional responses are unconscious. You feel something before you know what triggered it. What reaches consciousness is not the processing, it's the output. The deliberation ran somewhere below awareness. The conclusion was delivered upstairs. What you experience as thinking through a problem is frequently receiving the results of thinking that happened elsewhere and then narrating it. The screen, not the projector. And before any deliberation starts, before you even get the conclusion from the unconscious, the inputs are being shaped without your awareness. This is priming. Exposure to a concept, image, emotional state, or even physical sensation changes which neural pathways are accessible, which associations fire more easily, which options feel more natural, without awareness, without intent, without any sense that something was installed. The classic example: participants who held a warm cup of coffee before meeting someone rated that person as having a warmer personality than participants who held an iced drink. Same interaction, same person being evaluated, different cup. The physical temperature of an object they'd been holding minutes earlier shifted their social judgment, and they had no idea. In another study, participants who carried a heavy clipboard gave higher estimates of the importance of issues they were rating. The physical weight of an object shifted their abstract judgment of conceptual weight. Words on a screen, visual images, ambient sounds, the mood you arrived in, all of it is continuously shaping which thoughts are more accessible, which options feel more natural, which conclusions arrive first. The decision feels like it emerged from careful evaluation. It was shaped upstream before the evaluation began by inputs you didn't track. Advertising works entirely on this principle. Political framing works on this principle. Social media feeds are priming machines. They shape what's cognitively accessible, which shapes what feels obvious, which shapes what you conclude when you sit down to think about something. By the time you begin consciously deliberating about a choice, the field has already been tilted, not by you, by what you were exposed to before you knew there was a field. Now the emotional piece, because this one is counterintuitive and important. Antonio Damasio, a neuroscientist at USC, has spent decades studying patients with specific brain damage, particularly to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, a region involved in connecting emotional responses to decision-making. Patients with this damage retain their full reasoning capacity, IQ intact, language intact, logic intact. They can analyze options, construct arguments, identify relevant factors. Everything you'd associate with rational deliberation is preserved, and they make catastrophic, real-world decisions consistently, over and over. They can't hold jobs, relationships collapse, financial decisions are disastrous. Despite being able to reason perfectly about any individual question, their actual choices, the ones that matter in real life with real consequences, are terrible. Damasio's explanation is the somatic marker hypothesis. Emotional responses, gut feelings, physical sensations associated with thinking about outcomes, the visceral pull toward or away from options, aren't interruptions to rational decision-making. They're not noise. They're not bias contaminating a pure reasoning process. They are the substrate that decision-making runs on. They carry compressed information about past experience, pattern recognition, too complex for conscious analysis, rapid evaluation of consequences. Without them, decision-making doesn't become more rational. It becomes untethered. Phineas Gage, the famous 19th century case of a railroad worker who survived an iron rod through his prefrontal cortex, changed personality dramatically after his injury, historically framed as losing his reason. Damasio reframed it. He lost the emotional infrastructure that reason depends on. His reasoning faculties were largely intact. His ability to make functional real-world decisions was destroyed. The feeling in your gut about a choice isn't clouding your judgment. It's your judgment, the fastest, oldest, most experienced part of it, running on pattern recognition accumulated over a lifetime, trying to make decisions purely rationally. Suppressing emotional response doesn't produce better decisions. It removes a critical data source while maintaining the illusion of precision. Good decision-making isn't reason overriding emotion. It's reason and emotion integrated, each doing what it's best suited for. Now, Feynman's warning, because this is where it gets specific. Feynman was obsessed, genuinely obsessed. He came back to it throughout his career, with the distinction between knowing something and knowing its name. You can know the word inertia. You can define it correctly. You can use it in a sentence and understand nothing about what actually happens when objects resist changes in velocity. The name isn't the thing. The label isn't the knowledge. He applied this to himself constantly. He'd catch himself using a term he couldn't fully explain from first principles and take that as a signal that he didn't actually understand it. He just knew what to call it. Most conscious deliberation is manipulation of names, labels, inherited framings, pre-installed conclusions. That's not realistic. You have to be practical. That's just human nature. These aren't thoughts produced by deliberation. They're conclusions stored as categories, retrieved and applied. Thinking with ready-made tools rather than building new ones. Genuine thinking, the kind that produces insight, that changes understanding, that arrives at something genuinely new, mostly doesn't feel like deliberation. It feels like realizing. Something surfaces. A connection appears that wasn't visible before. The understanding arrives, often when you're not consciously working on the problem, and you experience it as discovery rather than manufacture. The moments of conscious deliberation, carefully weighing factors, constructing arguments, evaluating options step by step, can produce good analysis. But they're also where rationalization lives. The interpreter at work, finding a story that justifies a conclusion the unconscious had already reached, constructing the reasoning backward from the destination. What feels like reasoning is sometimes reasoning, and sometimes it's the interpreter building a bridge to somewhere the unconscious already went, and calling the bridge the journey. Feynman's warning applied here. If your conscious deliberation always arrives at conclusions that confirm what you already believed, you may not be deliberating. You may be rationalizing. The interpreter is very good at its job. So what do you actually do with all of this? First, this is not an argument for passivity. The unconscious is shaped. It's not fixed, not immune to influence, not running independently of any input you provide. What you expose yourself to, what you practice, what you spend time thinking about, what problems you sit with over months and years, all of that shapes the unconscious processing that produces the outputs you eventually experience as thoughts and decisions. The inputs you choose matter enormously. They just matter upstream of where you usually think you're making choices. The Libet veto is real. There is a gap between the impulse arriving and the action executing. That gap is where the most reliable form of deliberate choice lives, not in initiating actions. The unconscious has a head start there you can't overcome, but in pausing before acting on what arrived, in asking whether this impulse, this conclusion, this obviously correct feeling thought, whether it deserves to run before you've looked at it. What you can't control is the first thing that arrives, the first reaction, the immediate judgment, the gut pull that comes from below and you didn't author it. What you can control is the gap, whether you act on it immediately or whether you pause long enough to ask where it came from and whether it should be trusted. The biggest decisions you've made in your life are the ones that shaped where you are now. Some of them felt like deliberate choices. Some of them felt like they just happened. Both feelings are partly right and partly wrong. The unconscious was running in both cases. The interpreter explained both in retrospect. The question is whether you use the gap. Feynman's warning isn't that you have no agency. It's that the agency you have is not where you think it is. It's not in the grand deliberation, the careful weighing, the rational analysis you feel so certain about in the moment. It's in what you choose to expose the unconscious to over months and years, and in the gap between impulse and action that exists for fractions of a second or sometimes days. The brain decides before you do. That's real. The unconscious builds the choice. The interpreter explains it. Consciousness announces it. But the unconscious was shaped by choices you made before about what to read, who to listen to, what to practice, what problems to carry. And the gap is yours every time if you use it. You're not the author of the first draft, but you have editorial power. The question is whether you exercise it before hitting send. Subscribe if this changed something about how you understand your own mind. The next video goes somewhere else that's just as uncomfortable